Well, thank you everybody for coming out for the second session of 3 sessions to talk about one of the great thinkers, philosophers, theologians of the 20th century, Rav Kook. Before winter break, Rabbi Feinstein spoke about Abraham Joshua Heschel for several sessions, and now we're turning to Rav Kook for several sessions. And as I explained last time, not that it's a perfect analogy, if Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel represents kind of a modern or even postmodern American Jewish philosophy, theology, then Rav Kook stands as the Israeli counterpart from that side of the Jewish narrative of the 20th century. And so we've arrived at these two different thinkers, and it really, the more that I study Rav Kook, the more excited I am to teach Rav Kook, because I feel like his teaching is so relevant today. We went over his biography very, very briefly last week, and basically if we want to focus on the 3 dates on his gravestone, are the 3 dates of significance in his life, as he and his students claim. There's the 1904 date, the 28th of Iyar, which is the date that he made Aliyah and he first set foot into the land of Israel. There is the date of the 28th of Iyar in 5679 in 1919, which is the date that he became the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, right? He arrives to Israel in 1904 to become the chief rabbi of Jaffa, and then is ostensibly promoted 15 years later to become the chief rabbi of Jerusalem and the first chief rabbi of pre-state Israel, essentially, over Ashkenazim and Sephardim and all people who are participating in the yeshuv at that time. And then 1935 is the date that he passes away, the 3rd of Elul. And he has traveled and written a great deal over the course of his career. But again, I focus on these years that he was trapped in Europe, right? He makes Aliyah early on in his life, his career, and then he, on a speaking tour essentially, in Central Europe, he gets trapped during World War I amidst the war, and he's not allowed to return, and he's actually imprisoned by Germans to see if he's a spy or what his situation is, and he manages to sneak away to safety in London, where he remains in London for several years, and he writes about his entrapment in Europe and how he can't get out. And from this point moving forward, talks about the scary situation that Jews in Europe are, essentially when they've lost control of their own agency. And he returns to Israel, and he writes Orot, which is this book that I'll be teaching. I am teaching, right? And I'll be teaching 2 essays from Orot each and every week. So today is the second 2, and then next week I'll teach the final 2. We'll learn 6 different essays within the Orot compilation. And again, just so that we see, last week we studied essentially what he writes about God to start there, but that's not necessarily where he starts. That's not where Orot starts. This is the order that I've decided to teach Rav Kook, because I think that you have to understand his view of God and God's role in the world. And I think you have to understand the way that he sees Israel's place in the world and in humanity at large. So everybody here has a printout of the PowerPoint that I've created here. And again, I just bolded several ideas in these first 2 essays that we studied last week about Jewish role in the world and God's role in the world. So we basically have we can recapture it very quickly. In his essay entitled Whole God Knowledge, Understanding the Entirety of God, he writes that humanity has a surviving inheritance in Knesset Yisrael, in whose orbit the divine sympathy is found. Meaning to say, even if the whole world becomes rotten, the last hope for humanity is left in this people who carry this very special promise, this very special role in the world, right? And so when you look at the steps or the relationship between the world, humanity, then in his opinion, the gathering of Israel, Knesset Yisrael, and then you look at the levels of divinity, that's how he sees the relationship between God and humanity. And then we studied last week, chapter 2, Healthy National Instincts. Am I right? Yeah. And he writes, Hateva motze et ridito b'kibbutz, nature finds its control in the human collective. And I wanted to show you that already in his writings, he's incorporating terms that we associate very much with Israel. I don't know of other rabbis who refer to the human collective as a kibbutz. I don't know if we're going to start seeing, but in his writing, and again, he's not only a rabbi, he's not only a theologian, he's a poet, he's a songwriter, he is very much a Renaissance man in that way, and he uses language in a very unique way to portray not only a thought process, but a very specific perspective. And then the chapter ends, so goes it in all avenues and situations. The battle of existence makes its way in the material world as well in the spiritual world, the world of opinions, and the world of concepts. He is engaged in what he imagines to be a war for the future of humanity. Right? Make no mistake about it, I think that Rav Kook was an absolute prophet of his own time, clearly seeing the demise of European Jewry, with almost absolute clarity in terms of what was going to happen. And he believed that the struggle needed to occur in a physical sense and in an ideological sense. Right? Judaism and the goodness of humanity, for its survival, had to not only physically defeat our enemies, but we had to actually prevail with better ideas of a better future. And in that way, I want to arrive this week to where he sees the answer, right? If we lay out the problems with humanity as it stood in his lifetime, and the state of the world as it stood in his lifetime, then the question is, what is the solution? For Abraham Joshua Heschel, the solution was a kind of universalist theology saying that people were supposed to stand up for one another. Does everybody understand that? That leads perfectly into his idea that he should be praying with his feet. He belonged in Selma, Alabama, standing in that line, crossing that bridge, because what Jews had to offer was a special kind of not only calling, but a gift of experience to lend to others. If we were slaves in Egypt, then when we saw slaves, we in fact needed to stand up and help them achieve their own exodus. Right? This is, everybody follows where I'm going with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel? And yet 1950s and 1960s New York is very different than the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s pre-state Israel. Especially, let's say, at the end of the 19th century Eastern Europe, in which Rav Kook is born. And so, for Rav Kook, the answer is very different in terms of what God and Judaism is bringing into the world and what we have to offer, because Jews are currently, in his age, in his mind, trapped in a different kind of imprisonment. Does everybody understand? The question of whether Egypt has ended is one that is not answered for Rav Kook, as we'll see in a second, because Egypt, in this process of Egypt, he lifts out of the physical sense and says, Egypt and the enslavement isn't only an idea that necessarily happens once. What we read about in the Passover Haggadah is a warning about an environment, a culture, a scenario that the Jewish people tend to fall into again and again and again. And whenever a people gives up their own agency, they fall victim to the oppression of another. Whether that be an oppression of ideas or whether that be a physical oppression, the battle that he believes that needs to take place is one that has to triumph for the betterment of the world. And so, what begins in the biblical times, not only in Egypt, but with the exile that occurs with the destruction of the temple and Jews being sent out to Babylonia, and then later, approximately 600 years, in the year 70, in the first century of the Common Era, the temple being destroyed and the Jews being exiled and scattered all throughout the world by the Romans. Rav Kook will argue that the exile in which the Jewish people find themselves in the 20th century is the same exile that was created approximately 2,000 years earlier. And the redemption that's possible for the Jews in the 20th century is the same redemption that was possible for Jews in every century before him. So he begins with this very powerful phrase, Hagi'ula nimshechet hi veholechet. The redemption continues. Now, that's in my opinion, a poor English translation. It really is that the redemption continues walking or continues processing throughout history, right? Just like there is a thread that runs through our history of exile and oppression and suffering, there's also a thread that runs through our history of redemption and godliness and possibility. The redemption from Egypt and the complete redemption of the future are one unending action. For people who believe that they reach the end of the Torah and the Torah ends, they're mistaken. For people who believe that they read the Haggadah and they close the Haggadah, and that means the end of the story, they're mistaken. Because the whole point of the story, the narrative of the Jewish people, is that it is one narrative that begins long, long ago with Abraham and Sarah, and it continues all the way to today, and that continues the sense of spirituality, that continues the sense of oppression, and that also continues the sense of redemption. All these possibilities are intermingled with one another in a continuous flow of narrative. The action of the strong hand and the outstretched arm, which we read over and over again in the Haggadah, right over and over again in the Passover narrative, which began in Egypt and continues throughout all eventualities. So God is always standing next to us with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, always beckoning us to call on it, to use it, to allow it to enter our lives, to allow it to help us unch ourselves towards redemption. Unch is a technical term. Moses and Elijah are redeemers in a single redemption. Right? Those are characters that played in Jewish history, in the Jewish narrative, at a single point. The beginner and the ender. Moses marks the beginning of redemption. Eliyahu Hanavi, the end of redemption, right? We pray for Eliyahu Hanavi to show up with Mashiach, and that would mark the coming of the next world, Olam Haba. So one is the beginning of a redemption narrative, of the redemption from Egypt and Yitziat Mitzrayim that we're reading right now in the Torah. And the other, Eliyahu Hanavi, who we believe never died, right? Eliyahu Hanavi Elijah the prophet gathers all of his students together, and he gives his shawl to his student Elisha, and then he walks on the other side of the river, and he gets into a chariot, and then that chariot becomes like a golden Uber that flies off into the heavens, and we see him fly off into the heavens, and his students see that he doesn't die, and then on Pesach, we believe that Eliyahu Hanavi flies around the golden Uber and enters all of our homes, and that's why we set a place for him, and we open up the door, and we sing Eliyahu Hanavi, right? We don't believe that on at Havdalah times at the end of the week, we sing Eliyahu Hanavi. At every bris that I officiate, we take the baby, and we place the baby on the chair of Elijah the prophet, and we say, this child could be recognized by Elijah the prophet, because all Jewish mothers think that their child could be the Mashiach, and then when it's not, we take the child and we circumcise the baby, and we continue with the ceremony. Moses marks the beginning. Elijah marks an end that still has not yet come. The spirit of Israel hears the sound of the movements, the redemptive actions brought about through all eventualities until the sprouting of salvation will be complete in all of its plenitude and goodness. The Spirit of Israel hears the sound of the movements. Our collective spirit understands that this possibility is out there for us. And I would argue that Rav Kook, if you read more of his writings, he argues that some of us can hear it and sense it more clearly than others. That's why Rav Kook travels around Europe trying to explain to people that the time has come, like many of his time. It's no different than Theodor Herzl. Herzl just had a different looking beard. Not all that different, to be totally honest, right? And didn't wear that kind of hat. He wore a different kind of hat. But they both traveled on speaking tours and carried a very similar message. The time has come for a redemption of the Jewish people. Herzl didn't call it a redemption. They both called it exodus on different occasions and different kind of milieus. And they were both calling it the same thing. One religious, one not religious. One carrying a tone of aristocracy almost. One, a message of the people. There were many people traveling around exactly at that time, sensing that this spirit could sense that these sounds were calling them, right? That the outstretched arm was being offered, and the Jews should, in fact, take it. Now, if we think that redemption, Geulah, all right, and Geulah, the redemption continues, if that's lifted into a spiritual realm, then, in a continuous realm, then we also have to look at what he means by teshuvah. And these are the two ideas we're going to focus on tonight. The idea of redemption from exile and teshuvah as return. And he also means teshuvah as a physical return and a spiritual return. We know teshuvah as a spiritual return. We talk about it every year right around the high holidays. Thank you. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we talk about teshuvah as one of the goals of the holidays. And I have not yet begun to talk about teshuvah as a physical return for people back to the sanctuary at VBS, but I think we're getting closer every single year that we're away from COVID, or that COVID begins to peter out, God willing. But we usually, rabbis don't talk about teshuvah in terms of a physical return. We don't. The physical return, the physical teshuvah, is most often spoken about in secular society around the secular New Year's, January 1st, when you see that there are special rates to join a gym. That's what we mean by physical return. But that's not what Rav Kook means in terms of physical return, and it's not what the Hasidic movements meant when they said physical return. It's not a return to physicality. It's actually a return for where you should be living in the world. And here we see the beginnings of a melding of a theology and a worldview, a political worldview, that come together as one. And it's this writing, and many writings just like this in Orot, that qualify him not only to be the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community from Europe, but his writings popularize over time through the Mizrahi countries as well, through the Middle Eastern countries, where people read his writings in Hebrew and say to themselves, perhaps he's right. Perhaps we should be leaving Iraq and Morocco and Libya and all of those places as well, right? So, Tzrichim le'orer et tchiyat Yisrael. We must arouse, awaken the renaissance of Israel. Renaissance is like a fancier way of saying Renaissance, of Israel, with all the faculties concentrated in the nation. It's fascinating to me because the word orer is used, or was used this year by both sides of the political spectrum in Israel in its marketing materials. You would drive by freeways, overpasses, there would be billboards that would say orer, and it would have a picture of name that Israeli politician on the billboard. So the idea of awaken or open your eyes was used on both sides, all sides, let's say, of the current Israeli parliamentary makeup to prompt an awakening, an arousal, people to rush to the polls, to voice their opinions. This kind of language has been around in Jewish political statement making, let's just say, for a long time. And the first place you begin to see it is in the writings of Rav Kook. Because when he says orer, he doesn't just mean wake up, like open your eyes. He really means open your heart and open your soul as well. He really means evaluate your life. The type of orerut, or the type of awakening that's supposed to occur when the shofar is blasted in Elul. There's supposed to be an arousal of the spirit of a new way of looking at yourself and the world around you. We must arouse the Renaissance of Israel with all the faculties concentrated in the nation, with all of her Torah, with our faith, our traits, our goodness, our wealth, our strength, our thoughts, our song, our essence, our life's passion, intellect, enlightenment, energy, and success. The meek will not inherit the earth. Jews have never thought that. Rav Kook is one of the first voices in the 19th and 20th century to begin saying, there are Jews moving to Israel to begin something special. If you are not willing to move there with all your entirety, examine this list and see to what extent you can devote to that process. Success, strength, essence, enlightenment, intellect. These were not Hasidic ideas of what someone could devote to another community's success in Israel before Rav Kook. Before Rav Kook, the mailers that went out were not supported with an essence of Torah. Rav Kook comes along and says, the JNF Pushkis, that's Torah. Supporting the beginnings of what was then called the Haganah, Israel's defense forces, that's Torah. If you can support us with intellect, who's a great example of supporting Israel with his intellect? Was Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein would not move to Israel. He was approached by Chaim Weizmann to make Aliyah. He would not make Aliyah, but he did support Israel in traveling around the world and raising awareness and money to build Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And believed that it was time that Jewish academics once again reassert themselves and bring their intellectual strength back to the spiritual strength of the Jewish people. So he wasn't leaving Princeton, but he was willing to travel around and speak on Israel's behalf. And Chaim Weizmann began to procure these people. Ben Gurion began to procure these people. These are all people whom in their lives spent time with Rav Kook. It wasn't just about fundraising. It was about actually gathering the best and brightest that they could to become experts in the fields, bring those experts to Israel. All these lights in her midst, we must bring out from the hidden storage, the hidden store place, to the light of life. Where are Jews in the world during Rav Kook's time? Eastern Europe, that's physically, and in a spiritual sense, he believes, or in a metaphoric sense, he believes by and large, were already in hiding. We're already living in a storage place, in an attic, in an annex. Long before Anne Frank, you read Rav Kook's books, and you think that the Jews of Europe are actually already hidden away. They don't want to actually, they can't. They can't meet the challenges, the tidal wave that's coming at them. And so he only sees the only possible way that these attributes are going to exist where they are is in storage, is in hiding. But were they to want to come out in the world, they could come out in one place in their totality, without compromise, without any aspect of it being hidden away. The spiritual sense sees the torch of Israel ascending. From the land of Israel flowers all. The success of the Jews in Israel during Rav Kook's time actually nourishes the Jewish people throughout the world. Throughout the world. It gives them hope. It gives them a sense of what a future could look like one day. Whether it be these completely secular Jewish people that Rav Kook writes halachic tshuvot, legal pieces on to permit their work. Permits their work on Shabbos, he permits their work on Jubilee years, on all kinds of, right? He talks about the produce during Shemitah, how to make it possible. And why does he do that? He does it because he thinks in their essence what they're doing is living out Torah. This ends up being one of the great debates that he has as he travels around the world. Who is living Judaism better? The Jews of Europe who are putting on talis and tefillin every single morning, or the Israeli community that wakes up in the morning, doesn't put on talis and tefillin, and go works the land? This is a debate that he regularly engages in as he travels throughout Europe, and he's sent throughout Europe to represent, again, he represents Zionism to the religious community, and he represents orthodoxy to the secular community as he travels around and argues that one day there is going to be, in his opinion, right, a religious and Zionist revolution in the Jewish people, and we'll all end up there worshiping in the way that we imagine. Each and every individual of Israel has his or her nucleus in the land of Israel, which is stored in the interior of his spirit with enormous longing and love. So he would argue within every Jewish person exists this North Star. For each of us, our compass is ultimately pointed to that place. Not only spiritually, so it's not only that when we stand up to daven, we face east, because in some sense, we want to face Jerusalem, we want to face the land of Israel, and in a spiritual sense, and in a physical sense, it's also true. And he thinks that is embedded within all of us. The Lebovitz Rabbi famously said that there is a pintaliyah, there's a flickering flame in every Jewish soul, right, that needs to be fanned, right? So how do we fan it? We fan it by introducing Jewish experience, by introducing Jewish insight, inspiration. And so when someone walks up to you on the street corner and asks you, would you like to put on tefillin? They're not asking you because they believe that you've never put on tefillin and this is going to be like some kind of foreign experience and the mitzvahs for them. They're asking because they believe that when you put on tefillin, you will be, the spark will grow. If they ask you if you've lit Shabbos candles or if you're going to light Shabbos candles and they're standing out, passing out candles to everybody, the same thing is true as well. They believe that they are moving the Jewish people forward in terms of the Jewish people's mitzvahs. It's not a mitzvah for them to do those things. They believe that they're fanning the flame within every single Jewish person. Rav Kook sees it the same way. We have to remember that early on in his life, he studied alongside what is to be understood as what became the Chabad movement. Very early on in his life, before he went to the second yeshiva, the first one was a Chabad, and he essentially brings a lot of the foundational ideas to his writing and adds onto it a layer of Zionism as well. I'm going the wrong direction. Now, my question to you is, an idea of redemption, an idea of teshuvah. Why is Rav Kook the first one to marry these two ideas together? After all, in the Passover story, in the Haggadah, right, we are redeemed from Egypt and we are returned in so many ways, right, to the land of our ancestors. You all with me? Yeah? And yet nowhere in Passover, and you can correct me if you've heard this before. And if you say you've heard this, I'll say that rabbi probably read Rav Kook, so it's a circular logic. But where have you ever heard somebody talk about the ideas of teshuvah in the Passover narrative? Ideas of teshuvah in the Purim narrative. Ideas of teshuvah in the Hanukkah narrative. And yet, Rav Kook sees teshuvah, this idea of this spiritual return and physical return, in all of them. Maybe not in the Purim narrative, we would talk about that, but in the Hanukkah narrative, in the Passover narrative, because not only do the Jewish people turn back towards God, but we turn back towards a self-determination within the land itself, within our ancestral inheritance. The whole point of Exodus from Egypt isn't to wander in the desert in circles for 40 years. It's to get to the land of Israel. It's to go home. The point of the Hanukkah story, the narrative, isn't, or could be, a spiritual redemption, right? That's represented by the candles. But it's also a physical redemption. It's to break the shackles of the Assyrian Greek oppression of Antiochus IV. And it is to establish a Jewish government controlling the land of Israel for the first time in almost 500-600 years. Every time that teshuvah comes up during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we talk about it as a return to the best version of ourselves, or a return to the crossroads, the fork in the road, where we made a decision to act a certain way, to behave a certain way, and we have the opportunity to turn back the clock. As the famous scholar Yosef Yerushalmi explains in his book Zechor, Jews come along and we say, everybody in the world thinks that time moves on a line. We don't. We bend it completely and we say time is a circle. We can go back to any moment we want to go back to. And the way that we go back is each and every year we relive the Jewish experience over and over and over again. And that's how somebody sits down at the Passover Seder and they can see the people who sat around the Passover Seder in years past. They can see cousins and aunts and uncles and spouses who are no longer there at the Passover Seder. Because by retelling the Passover story each and every year, not only do we go back and place ourselves back in Passover, back in Egypt each and every year, such a horrible experience, we want to relive it each and every year, but we also place ourselves back at the Seder table. And it's a very powerful experience to say, We're going to return back to the Seder table. We're going to sit around the same seats. And then someone sits in a new seat because somebody's no longer sitting there. And it ends up being one of these moments where teshuvah is complicated. To go back is complicated. It's not supposed to be an easy process. The longer that I'm a rabbi, the more skeptical I am that anybody in the Jewish people undergoes any kind of teshuvah before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's a great talking point for rabbis. It's wonderful. How many of us actually call someone, approach someone, and say, I did something really, really lousy. I did something really lousy, whether it be this past year, when I was a teenager, however long ago, and I just wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I'm sorry, and I'm not going to do things like that again. We say a lot of liturgy that refers to that kind of moment. I don't know very many stories about people who actually perform those kinds of acts. And in here, what Rav Kook is talking about is an act of the performance of an act that most people, even though they say they want to do it over and over again, in almost all of our prayers, he does not see it happening. He does not see it happening. If you say Birkat Hamazon after eating, every single time you eat, you will recite the prayer, Uvenei Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh B'mehera V'Yameinu, Baruch Atah Adonai, Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim Amen, right? Blessed are you, Lord our God, who builds Jerusalem with a great deal of compassion or mercy. We make these Zionistic statements all the time, turning our attention from whatever table we're eating at that moment. We suddenly call upon our connection to Jerusalem over and over and over again. And here Rav Kook is saying, if you talk about these ideas of teshuvah, and you talk about the ideas of Jerusalem and Israel all the time, if you went through the Siddur and counted how many times we mentioned the words Yisrael, Yerushalayim, or Tzion, you would not be able to count that high. And so what do we mean? What are we saying? The only way that he can make sense of it is by combining both ideas together and saying, each and every year we hold out hope. We hold out hope that teshuvah is possible for those of us who need it the most. And we keep repeating it because we know we need it. And for whatever reason, most of us choose not to engage in it in a deep, deep way. For him, it's the same exact thing as making Aliyah. We talk about Israel and our connection to Israel all the time. And yet, for most of us, he would argue, we're not doing it. And if we're not doing it, then what we're talking about is the same exact thing as teshuvah. It's kind of a holding out hope in a spiritual sense. And in a physical sense, teshuvah for him means physically returning, taking your feet out of the exile, planting them squarely in the land of Israel, having this profound moment like him where your life is changed forever. And in that process, he recognizes that it's more than just a physical presence, that the Jewish people have to bring with us our Torah, our faith, all of our goodness, our wealth, our strength, our thoughts, our songs, our passions, our wisdom, and all of our enlightened ideas from around the world and all of our modernity. And in that moment, he believes that Israel would become a thriving, modern center, not only for Jewish life, but for humanity at large. Yeah. So the question was, while Rav Kook was traveling around the world, trying to get people to move to Israel, where was his family? So his wife and his son live in Jaffa for most of his life. Then when he moves to Jerusalem, they come to Jerusalem with him. His father-in-law was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem before him. I talked about him a little bit last week, saying he believed so much in Rav Kook that he said that he was simply keeping the seat warm for him, while Rav Kook was meant to be the chief rabbi of Israel, of Jerusalem, the entire time. But his birth parents and his family, I don't believe ever come. I don't believe ever come. He follows his in-laws and his wife's family, but his biological family, I believe, remains in Eastern Europe. And by the way, that's not even today, that's not a rare story. People move to Israel and they have to find new family there. They have to find new family, right? When we lived in Jerusalem, you end up leaving the kids with neighbors that you've never met before, and everybody understands that, because so many people there have moved from other places in the world that they end up bonding together to become family, because they've left the construct of biological family far away. And he absolutely believes that process is not only suitable, it's not only fitting and necessary, it's actually in some ways what's supposed to happen. That these people are bound together, these pioneers, these kibbutzim that he sees out in the world, the way these kids come together in these kibbutzim, they're bound together by something deeper than just biology. He believes it's deeper than family, that this ideology, this spirit, this new spirit of a new type of Judaism, of a new type of Jew, is a bigger, more compelling idea than their connection to their biological parents in Eastern Europe. Are there any other questions? Yeah, David. We're going to make Louise run from one corner to the other here. Yes. She's got to get all of her steps in. Yes, thank you. Thank you, David.
Being that from the time of the Romans until mid-1800s, there really weren't a lot of Jews in then Palestine. How practical would it be for a Kook to have come 100 years before and teaching this? Would it have been any different than Sabbatai Tzvi or others who preached it, but because of politics and the Sultan and the Crusaders and whatever, they couldn't do it?
Right. So Shabbatai, for those of you who don't know Shabbatai Tzvi, he's the false Messiah in the 1600s, and he claims a lot of things and calls on the Jewish people to do a lot of things, mostly horrifying, and they listen to him, and the whole thing ends up becoming a really terrible, terrible chapter in Jewish history. So excuse him for 1 second from this conversation. Let's go to the idea, and I think David's asking a good question about any chapter of history, essentially. Could George Washington's message have been proven successful had it come 100 years earlier? The answer is probably no. And I just picked George Washington as a kind of random example of somebody who espoused a philosophy or a physical agency. Rav Kook's message, there were Hasidic messages that were extraordinarily Israel-centric before Rav Kook. And Rav Kook's message resonates the way that it does most likely because he is also swept up in part of the second wave of Aliyah. Right? So just so everybody remembers how Aliyah works, right? I don't know how many people have played here like Oregon Trail. It was a computer game when I was little. But this is the way that I teach people my age about the way that the state of Israel was founded, right? So the first wave of immigration to Israel occurred, let's say, in the 1870s, the 1880s. Before Herzl, Jews began thinking we should probably end up leaving Europe and going there. In that wave of Aliyah, Jews came from Western Europe, and they came to the leaders of the Arab peoples that were there living in Jerusalem at the time, and in Israel at the time, the muftis. And they said to them, you have to remember, Israel was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and they said to them, we would like to buy land from you. They said, great. So they sold them the strip of land across the sea. That was the beach area. That was no connection to the Jewish heritage sites that Jews wanted to visit. Jews coming from Europe thought beachfront property might be nice, so they bought the property. And Western doctors, lawyers, Western European intellectuals moved to Israel, promptly divided the land into individual parcels with no farming history whatsoever, began to farm the land, and almost immediately what happened to them? They died. They died of typhus and dysentery and all kinds of terrible things, and they died from mosquitoes, and they died from everything that you could imagine. And what happened to the land? The land was reconfiscated immediately back by the muftis, and it was like nothing had happened, right? So then the second wave comes along, and they send a group of sages to Israel, right? By sages, I mean people who are there to buy land according to a plan. And they said to the same group of Arab leaders, we're here and we'd like to buy land from you. If you're those Arab leaders, what are you thinking? Should you do it or should you not? What did you say? Another group of suckers. That's exactly right. This is a tremendous annuity. Every 20 years, a bunch of suckers come and buy this land from us, and they drop dead almost immediately. Go ahead, right? This is how we're going to send our kids through college. This is terrific. But something very unexpected happens. We don't send doctors and lawyers from France and Germany and intellectuals. Who comes as part of the second wave of Aliyah? Farmers from Eastern Europe. They're not going anywhere. These are tough people. They know where they're coming from. They see beachfront property. They think to themselves, living in Jaffa and Tel Aviv, we're going to make this work. We're going to plant eucalyptus trees. We're going to do things to get the swamps and the mosquitoes away from us. And we're going to build ourselves a little village here. And that's exactly what they do. And Rav Kook from Eastern Europe is part of that wave. And his ideology, as David points out, ends up fitting splendidly into this moment of history, where he ends up being in the right place at the right time to be celebrated, not only because of the way that he incorporates Torah and Zionism as one, but because he looks at Jews across the street who are secular and cut their hair and don't wear black suits and black tie and black hats. And he looks at them and he says, these people are performing a mitzvah. These are amazing Jews. And because he believes that every single Jewish person living in Israel is performing mitzvahs every single day, and everybody is outstanding, the people of Israel during that process of immigration absolutely adore him, because he fights for them against the community that he emerged from, the community that he very much represents and he leads. And he's criticized by rabbis all throughout Europe. And I think it's one of the reasons we still teach him and talk about him, is because it's still a hope. It's still a hope in Israel that the religious community will look at the secular community, and the secular community will look at the religious community with this kind of affinity and appreciation, and say to one another, that each of us are performing these tremendous mitzvahs each and every day. So I think, David, you're right in the sense that the context of his life, the framework of what's going on in history, and the idea that he bridges the gap between Ottoman control of Israel and the British control of Israel. He bridges the gap between kind of let's say a pre-Enlightenment, Lawrence of Arabia Israel, and a British colonial Israel, and he himself is a product of Yiddishkeit, of yeshivas, of Enlightenment thought, of essays and poetry and songwriting, all the stuff that he can transcend these kinds of boundaries. He speaks to so many different communities and demographics that he is a good voice, a perfect voice for his time. The idea that his voice has been studied and carried for so many decades, almost a century later after his death, we're still analyzing his writings and talking about his teachings, reveals the impact that he had on us as Jews and us as Zionists. I hope that's an answer to your question. Any other questions? Because Louise is already standing and ready to go. Well, let me just close on this before we move on to next week. I felt like the class had to end on him speaking about what the actual land of Israel is all about. Right? What is the land of Israel? And I'll begin class by talking about this next week, but I'll just end class by talking about it this week. Were everyone here to go to rabbinical school, right, and begin in the fall, you go to the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at AJU, you would have a first-year Jewish philosophy class with Rabbi Brad Artson. You'd have a fourth-year Jewish philosophy class with Rabbi Elliot Dorff. And you spend time with both of them, and both of them would teach you about a kind of two sides of the coin of Jewish philosophy from the Middle Ages. And you would write essays in both their classes. You would say, wait, but I've written this essay before. And you realize you write it in a bunch of different classes throughout rabbinical school. And it's a comparison between two very different types of thinkers who live almost at the same time in the 11th, 12th century of the Common Era, one of whom everyone is familiar with. Everyone's heard his name. His name is Maimonides, or Rambam. And he is essentially thought of as the founder of rational thought in Jewish philosophy, right? Kind of an Aristotelian thinker within rabbinic Jewish philosophy. And then you have, on the other side, Yehuda Halevi, who is a poet and a writer and I would argue a romantic thinker, not an irrational thinker, but a romantic thinker in Jewish philosophy. And I thought, by and large, I was one of the only people who adored Yehuda Halevi, and his writing, his most famous writing, is called the Kuzari. And until I showed up at VBS, and I went to Morning Minyan, and our wonderful ritual director, Yossi Dresner, reads a passage in the Siddur right before the Yishtabach prayer that is a 6-line poem written by Yehuda Halevi about the Jewish people and about God. And I did not know that anybody ever read that passage or anybody ever included that, but we do here at VBS. One of the many reasons you should begin your morning at 7:30 in Schulweiss Chapel with us davening. And I'll just make this clear. In the essay, Rambam, you would write both of their names, Rambam on the board and Yehuda Halevi on the board, and we would divide them into 2 columns, and you write on the left side all these different issues, right? So the first issue would be the land of Israel, right? Which is essentially where we will end up. We'll talk about next week on Wednesday night, but the land of Israel. For a rational thinker, for Maimonides, We're one to travel all the way down to Eilat. I don't know how many people have been to Eilat, but if you haven't been to Eilat, you should go to Eilat. Go to the Dolphin Aquarium. Tell them that Rabbi Lebovitz from VBS sent you. You scoop up some land, earth from Israel, and you hold it in your hand. And then you walk 20 minutes to the border, either border, it really doesn't matter, Jordan or Egypt. You reach across the border while people are screaming at you to stay on your side until you go through the international checkpoint. You reach across and you scoop up land on the other side. So in your hands, you have a scoop of land from Eretz Yisrael and a scoop of land from just outside of Eretz Yisrael. According to Maimonides, the thinker, the rational thinker, is the makeup of that land the same or different? The same, right? Two scoops of soil from the Middle East, right? Both are going to be very rocky sand if you've spent time in that part. And according to Yehuda Halevi, the romantic thinker, right, is the scoop of soil from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, the same as a scoop of soil from outside of the land of Israel? No, they're profoundly different. And how do we know that? How do we know that they're not the same? He would ask, how do you know that the Torah, that the Chumash is not another book? What is the difference between Torah and Shakespeare? You see a big red book and you know that it's the Chumash. You see a big red book and you see that it's Shakespeare. How do we know that they're different? Excuse me? God, how do we know? If we're just standing in an anthropologist and you see yourself two red books and you walk into this room, Yehuda Halevi might argue, when you close Shakespeare, you put it down. When you close the Chumash, before you put it down, you kiss it. You kiss it. Yehuda Halevi would argue that when Jews land in Jordan or Egypt, he's never seen anybody walk down the steps from the airplane and kiss the soil. Because we know when we're in that space that there's something very different for us. And it's not the makeup of the soil itself. There's something different that's going on about the land. In the same way that they talk about the revelation at Sinai would be another category, the same way that they would talk about kashrut, they would talk about godliness. We could go all the way down all the different categories. And if I coach you enough through it, all of you can write essays and submit them to Rabbi Dorf before we're done with this class. The idea being, this was not the first time. Rav Kook was not the first thinker to think that within the land itself, there is a different quality for us than there is in other places. He lived in other places. I would argue he lived in places where if you were looking for a whole lot of qualities, you would say Yiddishkeit was thriving in Latvia or Lithuania when he was born, where he was raised. Jewish communities were strong and very observant, and schools were full of students. They didn't have any problems with Jewish population, finding spouses for their children, making a living. And he goes to a place where all those things become issues. He goes to a place where it's exactly all those problems that I just mentioned. There's not enough wealth. There's not enough children. They have to keep bringing in youngsters over and over, right? Waves and waves, boats and boats of youngsters keep showing up. There's not enough students for the Jewish schools there because kids grow up and go to work quickly in Israel. There's too much work. There's not enough adults. And yet he looks at this scenario and he says, this is better for the future of the Jewish people. This is better. As I said last week, right? The analogy he uses in his poetry. We can get an orange tree to physically grow anywhere in the world, but when you taste oranges, you realize if you're tasting an orange that was grown in a place where it was supposed to be grown or not. He would argue, right? You taste an Illinois orange versus a Florida orange, you probably suspect almost immediately that Florida oranges taste better than Illinois oranges. And the argument that he's making is that a Jaffa orange is the place that orange trees are supposed to be planted, of all of the places. And he's not talking about orange trees or oranges, right? He's talking about the Jewish people. He's saying that we're one to see a renaissance of Yiddishkeit in its fullest sense. The place where it's supposed to take place is on that soil. And next week, we're going to talk about why. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.